What's up, everybody? This is Caleb of Father Dyer. This is your video for Luke chapter 10. I'm coming to you from a part of the church that some folks may not know about. This is called the Mark Feaster Historical Landing. This is a landing at the church that goes upstairs. If you didn't know there was an upstairs, there is. It's where Tyson, our youth director, has his office. There's some storage space and a weird catwalk that goes to the bell tower that I may film a video from or, possibly get stuck in. We'll find out how that goes. Here at this landing are artifacts that belong to Reverend Mark Feaster. He was pastor here at Father Dyer in the 60s and 70s and did a lot for the church. To my right are his robes. To my left is his desk, and I'm seated in a chair that I believed belonged to him. Here in Luke chapter 10, it starts in verses 1 through 12, where Jesus sends out 70 of his followers, so a good chunk of people, in groups of 2 to do the work that he has trained them to do and that they have seen him do for themselves. And so here Jesus is saying, okay, I'm not just here to do this myself. I'm here to show you what this is all about so that you can do it. Jesus here is starting the church, really, is what he's doing. And so they go out and Jesus gives them these instructions. Now, in verse 12, there is an interesting reference that I want you to pay attention to. So in verse 12, it mentions the place of Sodom. And there's a story about this town and another city, Gomorrah. You may have heard of those towns before. And if you're like, I don't know what this is or what this means or why Jesus is talking about it, I'm going to invite you to do your homework. I'm not going to tell you all about it here in this video because that would take forever and it gets weird. But do your homework. If you want to know more about this, you want to read Genesis chapter 18, verse 16 through chapter 19:29. Again, that's Genesis 18:16 through 19:29. So chapters 18 and 19, really. And then if you want clarification on what really was going on in that story, you got to look further down the story to the prophet Ezekiel. And I want you to read Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 46 through 50, if you want to know what that reference about Sodom is about. After Jesus sends the 70 out, he then, has a saying where he names some cities, and I want to put that in context for you. So Jesus starts off by talking about a place called Chorazin, Bethsaida, and Capernaum. These are all cities kind of located next to each other on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. So this is the area where Jesus has been doing his work up to this point, where he's been teaching and preaching and doing miracles. And then he names 2 other cities, Tyre and Sidon, which are north, where Jesus has not been. Very prominent cities, ancient cities, and they show up a lot in the history of the Eastern Mediterranean, especially Tyre. And Jesus says, okay, these cities I've been to, if these cities I haven't been to, if they had heard about these things or seen these things, they would have repented and come to God. And Jesus says, these places where I have done the work, they haven't done anything. And so Jesus is calling people's attention to be like, look what's happening in front of you. And just be amazed by it. Allow it to transform you and change you. And Jesus still has that message for us today. In verses 17 through 20, the 70 return, and they bring a great report to Jesus. They say, we're doing work, healing people, casting out demons, all this great stuff. And then Jesus gives thanks for that. And he mentions Satan, and as we mentioned in other videos, some of you may believe in the devil, some of you may not. And I'm not going to tell you what to believe on that. You got to figure that out on your own. And Jesus rejoices at what the disciples are able to do. But then he has a key thing where he says, well, don't rejoice that you have this power now. Rejoice that your names are written in heaven, in the book of life. So Jesus is saying here, okay, do what I'm telling you to do, but be humble about it. And if you're going to rejoice that you have a relationship with God and that God has forgiven you and that God has called you. Message is the same for us today. Always be humble in what we do as the church. Just rejoice that we have a relationship with God and that God has called us to do this work. The work is not what we rejoice in. God is what we rejoice in. In verses 21 through 24, Jesus rejoices at the people that he has called to join him in the work. He calls them infants. So interesting language there on the part of Jesus. What Jesus is really getting at here is that look at who God has chosen. Look at who God has called to do this work. It's not the rich. It's not the powerful. It's not the smartest, the most well-known, those who have the most followers on social media, those who have the power and the privilege. No, it's just the people who accepted the invitation. I said, come and follow me. And these are the people who said yes. And that was kind of the only criteria that Jesus had. And we've seen that throughout the story as Jesus calls people. Some people accept the invitation and some people haven't. And that's true for us today. You can accept the invitation to follow Jesus. You don't have to, but that's the only requirement, is that you say yes. Jesus literally doesn't care about anything else. And that's what Jesus is giving thanks for here. I give thanks for the people that said yes to the invitation. I don't care about anything else about who they are, who they aren't, what they've done, or what they haven't done. After that, we have the story of the Good Samaritan. And I want to note for you here that the way the scripture tells the story is everything from verses 17 through 37 kind of happen all at once. The 70 return from their mission. Jesus talks with them. He rejoices. And then this happens immediately in that context. So what happens to set up the story of the Good Samaritan is a lawyer asks Jesus a question, because maybe he's there and he's overheard Jesus rejoice. Maybe he was part of the 70. We don't know who this person was who asked this question. Maybe he was feeling excluded that Jesus didn't give thanks for him. And here's what happens next, whatever the person's motivation. He's there in the presence of Jesus after the 70 have returned, and he asks Jesus, what do I have to do to have eternal life? And the way that Luke says it is that this person stood up to test Jesus. So maybe their motives weren't 100%. Who knows what this person's motives were? But amazing teaching flows from that, because Jesus can work with anything. So Jesus says, okay, well, what do you hear? What do you think is the answer is? What's written in the law, since you're a lawyer? And the lawyer responds with what's known as the Shema Israel, where it says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus says, right answer, which Jesus never says that to anybody, but Jesus says that here, right answer. You have answered correctly. Now, this would have been a great time for this person to just stop talking and just get on with their day, thinking okay, Jesus told me something today and I need to sit with that. But instead, the guy keeps talking. Lesson for us, sometimes just stop talking. Sometimes just learn, just take in what you've heard. Guy keeps talking though, and he says, well, who is my neighbor? And who knows what answer this person expected. But I'm pretty sure the lawyer did not expect what Jesus had to say next. And what comes next is the story of the Good Samaritan. Now, the whole crux of the story is that Jesus tells this story and chooses to make the hero the model to follow, a Samaritan. There's a huge backstory on why this is important. This is the worst person or type of person that Jesus could have chosen. Worse than choosing a Roman, worse than choosing a Gentile, a pagan, a Pharisee, a tax collector, anybody. This is the worst person in the ears of his audience that Jesus could have chosen. Samaritans were wrong on every level to a Hebrew audience. They were the wrong race, they were the wrong religion, everything about them was the worst that it could be. And yet this is the person that Jesus chooses to make the hero, to make the role model of this story. Could have chosen literally anybody, and Jesus chooses a Samaritan. And then juxtaposes that, puts that opposite against how people who should have known better, a Levite and a priest, and how they behaved. So after Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, the lawyers, he asks him, well, who was the guy's neighbor? And the lawyer is forced to say the Samaritan, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus says, go and do likewise. And so that's the whole point of the story for this man and for us, is that in where Jesus says, go and do likewise, go and show mercy, no matter who you are, who someone is. The differences that you've constructed amongst yourselves don't matter. Go and do mercy. Go and do likewise. Instructions for us still today. All these differences we've constructed between ourselves, race, religion, ethnicity, class, socioeconomic background, education, language, legal status, orientation, Jesus doesn't care. He says, go and do likewise. Go and do mercy. So go and do that in your life. Now, chapter 10 closes with the story of Mary and Martha. And this is an interesting story for the gospel writer to share with us. And this is one of those things where it's kind of like, what is Jesus getting at here? And what is the takeaway for us? So in this story, there's two sisters, Martha and Mary. Jesus comes to town. Martha plays hostess, has all this work to do, as if you've ever had someone in your house and you're wanting to treat them well and, play host, it can be a lot of work. And Martha is engaged in that. And Mary just sits and listens to Jesus. And that's kind of irks Mary. And she comes to Jesus and says, Jesus, have Mary help me with all these things I have to do. And Jesus is like, you know what, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things, but there's really only one thing that matters. And Mary has chosen that, and she's getting something out of it. Now, some of you may identify with Martha in this. I know that some of you watching this video are busy, that you do a lot for the church, for your communities, for your families, your households, your kids, your partners, that you do a lot. So you may identify with Martha in this story. And that's okay. Jesus isn't saying do those things. Jesus has nothing against that. I think what Jesus is getting at in this story is you got to prioritize sometimes. That because Martha was so busy, she couldn't be two places at once. She could either focus on all the stuff that she thought she had to do, or she could listen to Jesus. Like, they were mutually exclusive in this context. And situations come up for us in our lives where things are mutually exclusive. We can't be two places at once. None of us have all the time and energy and resources in the world. We have to prioritize, and we have to make choices. And I think that's what the lesson of this story really is that you're going to be confronted with choices where you want to do both. And Mary might have wanted to do it. Mary might have really wanted to help her sister, but really wanted to also sit with Jesus. Martha probably wanted to do both. Be like, I have to do all these things as a hostess, but I also want to sit with Jesus, and I can't do both. And so you have to make a choice. And what Jesus is saying here is that, if the choice is something that enriches you, even if it may not be what pleases other people, maybe choose that. If there's a choice that deepens your connection to God, that's the choice to make. And obviously, you got to figure out what that looks like in each and every circumstance. And it's sometimes going to be simple, and it's sometimes going to be really complicated and nuanced, and you're not going to know if you're making the right choice. But look to this guidance from Jesus. Sometimes you got to make priorities. Do the things that bring you closer to Jesus. Do the things that bring you closer to God and grace and the teachings and the wisdom that God has for you. That's what I got for Luke chapter 10. Check in tomorrow for Luke chapter 11. Coming to you from the Mark Feaster Historical Landing at Father Dyer United Methodist Church, I'm Calob Rundell. As always, feel free to send any questions you have about anything Bible related to me, Caleb@fatherdyer.com. We'll see you next time, and we'll see where where tomorrow's video comes from. Take care. Peace.